Hmm. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to most of you. Welcome in the first place, some of you. Real quick note on the way these webinars work here. It's super simple. Um, I'll introduce our guest today in a moment, but before we do that, basic rules here, safe space. You can say or think or feel just about anything here within the confines of basically respect. You can speak up, you don't have to, etc. My friend Bonnie and I will go through some slides, kind of level set and talk through some big stuff. And then we'll open it up to questions and comments and anything else from you. So now I'm gonna cut over to Sonia real quick, but let me just quickly introduce Bonnie. So Bonnie Chen is an old friend. We were just talking, I guess we met maybe 15 or 16 years ago at UCSF. And in that time, I've gotten to see Bonnie do all sorts of things, including to become a wonderful palliative care doc and also move into the world of being something of a receiver of this stuff too. We'll get into those details. But I think one of the overarching gists today with Bonnie is between the two of us, we're both physicians, but this isn't going to be a medical talk. This is probably likely going to be much more personal. I guess we'll see. Um, and I think we're going to explore today basically the sort of the human zone underneath our roles, whether we're giving care or receiving it. How do we kind of inhabit the human in the mix? So with that, welcome, Bonnie. It's really nice to see you. Thank you for being here. Um, all right. Before we get started, over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, BJ. And thank you for being here, Bonnie. As BJ said, he and Bonnie are they're gonna chat. And then after that, you have your opportunity to chat with them, to ask a question or comment on something. And you can do that in two ways. You can click the raise hand button and speak with both of them. Or if you'd prefer to not do that, you can type your question into the Q&A and I will read it aloud for you. The chat is also open, so if anything resonates with you, please feel free to just type a thought in there as well. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Sones. And as ever, thank you for the artwork. Beautiful, extra beautiful, maybe this time around. They're always beautiful. Um, so Bonnie, welcome. It's really nice to see you. I recognize this back. Um, do you want to maybe start with folks just introducing yourself, Bonnie, and bring us up to the moment with you a little bit, if you could.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the chance to be here with all of you and also to talk with BJ. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I came into medicine by way of my mom dying of cancer when I was 17, and really desiring to participate in the healthcare system, and eventually found my way to palliative care. And I have been a palliative care doctor for 11 years now, largely in the outpatient clinic setting with a practice in Oakland. And yeah, so I've always really enjoyed my job. And in those 11 years, was able to get married, start a family. Obviously, COVID hit the way it did for most people. And in the context of COVID, had my second son, Benji, in March of 2021. And life was sort of going along until July of 2022 when Benji died suddenly and unexpectedly and turned my life upside down. So yeah, I took a bunch of time off work, eventually found my way back to palliative care, and am practicing again now. And yeah, I think I'm taking this hour as a chance for a personal reflection for myself of what this journey has been like in the couple years since that loss. So.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. In 2 years, that's not very long. Um, or maybe it feels like an eternity. I don't know. This, yeah, will, where do you place yourself now? You've been back at work for a while. Is that right?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I took about 9 months off work completely and then took another 6 months to ramp back up to the schedule I'm at now. So, yeah, I've been back for a while, but also took a very extended break from life, really, I'd say. So
Yeah. And you've been kind to share some of your story along the way, like in real time. We'll include, by the way, folks, we'll include, Bonnie wrote a beautiful article. Where was that published? Where did you?
Chronicle, SF
Yeah,
Chronicle.
Chronicle. We'll include a link to that. That was a remarkable piece of writing, Bonnie. And one of the things that's been, you know, beautiful, I use that word a lot. I just mean that as sort of something deeply truthful, not necessarily pretty or easy, but the way you've in real time moved through your own grief with your own grief and included your community, um, has been really remarkable to behold. And I guess before we go any further, I just want to really thank you. That was an enormous gift you and Benji and your family have given the rest of the world. Uh, it almost feels like watching something gain a third or fourth dimension. Work may be sort of a thing we do, go through, we go to work, come home from work, and it's a piece of the story. But it feels like all that got just a huge wave went through the whole system. And it's been singularly remarkable to watch you ride all those waves and to somehow bring us along with you. So to start, a big thank you, sweetheart. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it because, in some ways it feels so hard to believe that it's been almost 2.5 years since he died. Partially because I feel like when you encounter big grief, immediately it feels completely unbearable, interminable, and just so shocking, even if, like, as in my case, I felt like I had dealt with grief before, but this just felt like a tidal wave. And it's interesting to reflect now. Obviously, like, I'm not out of it, and it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming the way it was. And you can't even really pinpoint when that transition happened because it felt all consuming for so, so long. So it's actually nice to have this time point to just mark for myself how different it feels now than even 6 months ago. And to recognize, like, you're just searching for any anchor, right? And people give you books or give you analogies and they all kind of wash over you. And now I can look back at even some of the platitudes and say, oh, I get what that means, but it doesn't land until you're actually experiencing it. Like, I don't know if any of you have heard that analogy to grief about, like, the ball in a room and how at first the ball takes up the ball is grief and it takes up the entire room. You can't, like, move even an inch without bouncing and hitting a wall. And that over time the ball doesn't get smaller, but your room gets bigger. And when someone first told me that a few months in, I was like, okay, no, you don't get it. You've never held this ball. This ball will always take up all the space. And now, as I feel myself in the in between, the bounces happen all the time, but I feel like I can recognize when a bounce hits, oh, I was free floating for a little while. And that analogy completely lands with me, even though when I first heard it, I was like, okay, whatever. You feel that way. I don't feel that way. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, there's something about, and that idea of the room getting bigger. I know and forgive me, I will, language doesn't do this zone. There are not a lot of words, at least that I have found, to describe some of the feelings that go along with grief like this. But that notion of it kind of blowing open your room, making this space, I have found myself, I don't know if it's registers with you, especially when we work with younger, learners, students or residents or something, or fellows, and you just haven't had a huge volume of life at that point, and that there's no shame in that. You can't, you know, that's just life, and it has to kind of happen.
Mm.
And it's part of our education in so many ways. But I just don't know through anything but some sort of big old, you know, some just torrent of suffering. I don't know how else to blow open our capacity. I don't know how to blow our heart open. I don't know how to get that room bigger without this stuff. And I don't know about you. I mean, I don't want to fetishize pain, and I don't want to make the mistake of reducing Benji's memory to silver linings, and it's also true that there are lessons learned and things gained in the loss. And again, forgive my language. Maybe you can tell me to fly a kite. But does that register with you, or just sort of clunky way of sort of appreciating what's actually happening without celebrating the misery or something like that? Um,
I mean, absolutely. I think even now, reflecting on my first year and a half, there's a way in which I can almost romanticize grief because it was so deep and profound. Um, and when I stop and think about it, I also have to acknowledge, there were times I didn't want to live. And so I did, like, there's no way I want to go back there. And yet, like you're saying, I am such a different person now in ways that I can say that I treasure that aren't like in any way worth the cost, but here we are, right? And so I appreciate that there are ways I see the world now that I wouldn't be able to had this not happened. And so it's sort of like tragedy happens, period. I'm grateful for who I am, what I've learned, period. And they're related, but it's not like, some scale is balanced in terms of worth. So yeah, I totally resonate with what you're saying.
And IU, that's a really beautiful way of putting it. I know I strive to sort of reconcile big things, bring them together, resolve or something like that. But as you're pointing to, it's sort of pain, period, yes, growth, period. And they're related, but it's not quite so pat or so simple. So thank you for giving us some structure. All right, I'll move us along just in the slides. We can go all over the place. And we'll return to your family here too with Rich. So, like we've touched on already, it so happens that you are a palliative care doc. It so happens that loss and grief, uh, existential issues, spiritual issues, issues of disconnection, etc., are in your wheelhouse or something like that. I always get, when people call us experts on grief or death or something like that, it never feels quite right. I don't know who gets to consider themselves experts if we don't all get to consider ourselves experts. But nonetheless, we have work that explicitly deals with the subject matter that you are very much dealing with in the entirety of your life. So I guess one question in that mix is it even possible now to, 2+ years now, has there been enough time to look over that period and to see where or how you've evolved, what's shifted, in your work or in your personhood? That may be way too big a question, but I guess it's just an opportunity to say, if you look back over these couple of years, is there something to, are there ways to characterize the evolution? You already did a little bit at the intro, but is there more to say and how it's affected your work?
Sure. Well, I'll start with personally, since, like I mentioned, I took 9 months off of work
Mm.
because I just couldn't imagine at first um, having space for anyone else's grief. So I think in both realms, personal and professional, it's a similar theme to what I've described, which is at the beginning, grief is just so loud. That's all there is. And so I can look back and see how really I was just trying to survive.
Mm.
And now I feel like my life is more than just survival, even though there are still moments that I have to kind of grit my teeth and bear. So personally, I mean, so much of the really early days and months I barely remember, and I thank God for like community. Like my sister and brother-in-law came over literally every day for months because it wasn't clear that me or Rich would be able to get through a day parenting our older son. And so if we fell apart, they were there to, make sure he got fed and clothed. And even that, like the basics of Maslow's hierarchy,
Mhm.
we were fed and clothed. Like our porch became this altar of chicken pot pies and ice cream and coffee that just would show up. Like anytime we opened our door, there was more food. Or like my friends would go to Costco and I just find like sweatpants because I don't know, people were just worried that, and it was true, like that I couldn't take care of the basics of living. And especially when me and Rich were both off work, we would just spend hours after we'd drop Sam off at school just wandering in the redwoods near our house because there was nothing to do exactly, especially after the memorial was over. And it was sort of unbearable to be in our home, which represented so much of the before times. But there was nowhere to go. Like I didn't even want to see anyone, right? Like the grocery store clerk could make me burst into tears. So the only safe place felt like nature and being in the woods and mostly like not even talking, just walking for hours. So that's like sort of what I remember of the very early days.
Mm.
And then I kind of got like a little bit type A academic about grief as like
Mm.
had a little more bandwidth to be telling myself, okay, I can't live like this, but I don't know how to move forward. And so I just sought out anything I could to try and get over or through. So I did tons of therapy, EMDR, took writing classes, went on retreats, joined support groups, did guided meditation and visualization, and spent hours with like various friends, other bereaved parents, old friends who were willing to just exist alongside me as I like kind of fell apart and put myself back together over and over again. And so I was still very much living grief 24/7, but maybe a little more intentional about it. And some of it worked and some of it didn't. Um, and then at some point, I started wondering about going back to work again. And I have this very amazing boss who, probably in the first month when he brought over a meal, said to me, I don't even want you to think about coming back to work until you can imagine it being part of your healing. And that gave me so much freedom
Mm.
to like not think about it for quite a while. And then when it started sort of entering my consciousness, I still paused for quite a while. And when I went back as like 2 half days a week of clinic. And I was very honest with my boss that I was framing it as really an experiment, not like this is me coming back, but this is me seeing if I can even be a doctor again. Um, and thankfully, it felt like putting on, your most comfortable pair of old slippers. Like I just fell back into it, and I was really amazed at how relieving it was, because at that point, 9 months into my grief, I still felt awkward around strangers, meeting new people. Like I had this like loud blaring alarm that, people didn't know about. And should I share? Should I not share? And with patients, all of whom were grieving in one way or another, it's like that alarm just silenced, like, and it's not like I was talking about Benji, but I just felt in the presence of people who knew what it felt like. And so I guess maybe not surprisingly, but for me, it was surprising and relieving to find that working again was very much part of
Hmm.
my healing.
What a wonderful cue your boss gave you, huh? What
Yeah,
wow, right on.
yeah,
And so it feels like, I mean, and it feels like it has helped, right? I mean, I think a lot of notions of self-care that we talk about or think about are handed, have to do with, going away from work, spa days, or, whatever, sort of trying to balance the workload by just somehow finding a way to not work somewhere, somehow,
yeah,
something like that, something pretty rudimentary. But in truth, sometimes work is exactly what we need. Um,
yeah.
and it sounds like, it's a matter of when and proportion and how to kind of pace yourself. Um, so are there ways, and this, again, there may not be an answer to this question, but my sense is it has changed the way you practice. I don't mean to say it, Benji's death, Benji's memory, your relationship has maybe shifted the way you do your work. But is that do you agree? Has it on some level?
Absolutely. I remember when I first went back, whereas I don't know, like I think maybe less so than other aspects of medicine, but I feel like I still would go into a given patient visit with somewhat of an agenda, right? Like you read the chart, like, even if it's like a good agenda, like I want to help with their pain and I want to explore, you know, what they think about end of life if that feels right. And I remember, especially when it was more hypothetical, as I was thinking about going back to work, my one and only charge I felt was I want each patient I encounter to feel less alone, because I really had this intense personal experience of loneliness being such a primary part of what grief is like, feeling like no one can understand, and to overcome alone with what you're left with feels not doable. And so, yeah, I think when I first entered in particular, I just went in with like no agenda to any given patient
Mm,
meeting. And that was very freeing in some senses, right? And it's not like then I wouldn't address pain or other things that came up, but it it would just happen more organically.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and I mean, even thinking about the doctor I was a year and a half ago when I went back to work and how I practice now, that's continuing to evolve. And I imagine that will be true as the rest of my career unfolds, not just because of grief, but because we're all changing as humans. But
Mhm.
um, I think, yeah, I remember at the very beginning, every patient who came in the room, I felt like I could relate something they were saying directly to my own experience of losing Benji. And so Benji was like right here at the front of my mind. And obviously, it was rare the cases where I actually disclosed about my own loss, but I I couldn't help but think about how I also had experienced a feeling that someone was putting on the table. And so those few times I did disclose to patients, those were big moments. I thought about it really deeply, whether I was going to share. When I did share, it was like this big offering. And for a few patients, we would almost spend like a whole session kind of unpacking our mutual relationship to grief. Like I
Mm.
remember this one patient, I think I shared with you, BJ, about who she was very open about death, and she told me about funeral planning, and she told me she was going to be buried in the cemetery where Benji's buried. And from that moment, I just latched on. I was like, I feel
Mm.
so connected. And then I didn't share at that moment, but then ultimately when I did, it we were just so connected by it. And I remember that first session when I disclosed to her and we talked through a bunch of things. And at the end, she said to me, Bonnie, I just want to thank you so much for sharing with me about Benji. As someone who considers herself pretty much an atheist, it makes me feel like I'm going somewhere. The fact that they would be in the same physical place, but I think also, obviously spiritually and existentially. And that was so moving to me, to just feel that connection to the point where when she died and her husband invited me to her memorial, like I changed a flight, to delay my spring break trip because it felt so important to me to attend, to be where Benji was, to feel that connection tangibly. And so like I share all that to say that like at the beginning, if I disclosed, it was like this big firework for me, like this is a big deal and we're so connected. Um
Mm.
and now I mean I'll often think of Benji, but it's not like right here, and I still rarely disclose, but sometimes when I do, it might just be a sentence about like how I feel touched by witnessing maybe an adult child parent relationship and how I feel connected to that. And then we move on.
Mm.
Um, uh, yeah, so I think it's just like so much quieter, how I relate. And that feels, I'm not saying one is better than the other, it's just sort of where I was and where I am. It still feels very genuine and connected. I just see how it has changed over the course of this year and a half of working.
Right. And thank you for not taking the bait on better or worse, something like that. Although in one of that, your essay in the Chronicle, so moving. In one of the ways in which it's so moving is there's almost, I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but apology is the wrong word, but an acknowledgement to patients before Benji that you had seen that where you just hadn't, if I'm remembering correctly, just life had not presented itself to you in such a way as for you to really, empathy could only get you so far with those patients. And now it seems like you are seeing or feeling things that connected you also to the past, to past patients. Am I remembering that correctly about that essay?
Yeah. It made me think back on interactions I'd had, and in some ways how I wish I had acted differently.
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, I'll say, I wrote that article just before I went back to work, so it was like relatively theoretical letter to my patients. And one of the beautiful things about writing it was I actually heard from a few past patients or their families, because most of those patients had already died, um, to say like, thank you for your letter and sharing how you plan to relate to patients differently. I want you to know that for us, you were already that person and that doctor. And I think we'll talk later about kind of refinding identity. But that was so key for me to hear from those few people, hear them say, like, I know you feel 100% different, and you aren't. I saw you there before this. Um,
Mm.
And, that was obviously not something I was expecting when I wrote the article. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's amazing, Bonnie. Well, there's so much here. We'll move off this slide, but one of the truths you're pointing us to is the word connection, has come up. And maybe what's happening is you've always been Bonnie. All this was in you, just as your patients lovingly pointed out. But maybe the bore of the connection is bigger now or something. I don't know. But the point, I guess, where I'm trying to go is the great thing about connection is when we're plugged in, the love or the care or can flow in all directions. And I think, you and I have talked a little bit about this. You've already referenced this in a way. I think in general, for folks listening in medical education and just the culture of the practice of medicine, a lot of the implied or explicit mode of caring is sort of unidirectional. I am the provider. I give you care. That is my job. That's what I'm trained to do. You lie still and take my care. It's very, yeah, it's an incomplete model. And it also has something to do with, I think, burnout and other things, but not to get lost in those weeds. It feels like what you're pointing to is realizing just how beautifully the care flows in both directions. And that's not only is that okay, like you gaining something from these encounters, it's not only tolerable, but my guess is your patience, and whether you disclose explicitly about Benji or you're just disclosing indirectly by the look, by the way you can hold eye contact a little differently, or the way you can sit with silence perhaps a little differently. In a way, don't you think those are kinds of self-disclosure? I mean, you are acting from this place. We don't need the words, but sorry, I'm getting off here. I guess to pull us back here. You've referenced how going back to work has been therapeutic on some level. But is there more to say about this two-way street opening up and realizing that the giving and the receiving, the distinction between self and other can get really beautifully blurry when there's trust? Um, is there more to say about that? Was that a surprise to you? Did you know that Karen sort of really needed to move in both directions to work?
I I think it's still something I'm learning. Um, I I think even at the beginning when everything felt so big, the fact that I did so much intentional, almost self-editing around disclosure, because, you know, there's a part of me that wanted to talk about Benji with every single patient that I met, comes from this idea of professional boundary of, you know, I'm here as the doctor. This is about the patient. And there's a certain degree to which that is true, right? We're not two friends meeting for coffee. Um, and I think you're absolutely right. There's some alchemy that can happen with select scenarios that require me to realize I'm just another human trying to get through this very difficult life, just as my patient is. And I think that, like, leveling of the playing field can be so beautiful and hopefully actually even empowering to my patients. And I mean, this idea of reciprocity of care, I've contemplated even since we talked last week, because I think even last week, I think I was starting to think about how my boundaries have gotten a little tighter again, you know, because I have less of that need to express at any given moment. Um, and in some ways, I feel proud of that. But since last week, I've been thinking about how do I feel proud of that? Like, there's something so beautiful, like you said, about the blurriness and the ability to be soft and affected. And that's doesn't have to be seen just as me taking, or, you know, suddenly like there's only so much oxygen and now, oh, this is for me, even though you're the one who's sick. It's
Mhm.
hopefully this kind of mutually giving reestablishing of identity for someone who's sick to actually be able to provide space for another. And so I don't know, I'm very much still learning and hope I can continue to grow in seeing it that way. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Ooh, it's a biggie, isn't it? Because it really defies, just as you're describing it, you can't make a rule around it. Self-disclosure, good. Self-disclosure, bad.
Right.
Receiving care, good. You can't, it just will not let us. This exquisite mode of care, this next level, whatever we're talking about here, this mode, which we might struggle to find the words, but you and I both know it's different from just coming in, writing a prescription, putting in a catheter, everything's going, out of us into someone else.
Yeah.
This is different and can be deeply healing, but requires such discernment too in
Mm.
real time. And maybe that's what we're pointing to, is a sort of a real time co-created notion of boundaries, that they're not walls. I chafe at boundaries when folks use them as a shield or something to hide behind. That seems importantly different. And they're not inert. They move. Our boundaries can move. And I suppose there's cautions in there for us, right? I mean, they're important too, boundaries. So I don't, it's just not, they're not going to let us, the majesty of what you're pointing us to is just not going to let us kind of put it into pat language here. But it does feel like perhaps maybe we can agree there's a sort of this is the life's work of our job, which is so cool. You can't, it just, even though the subject matter stays the same, the infinite variations on themes that actually happen in real time between people, we're just probably going to be learning till the day we die, the day we retire. But anyway, going off again. But one more thing on this slide before we get off of it. You commented to Sonia and me, it was so gorgeous to hear how you mentioned your boss. But another piece of going back to work, or maybe we should take going back to work, going to work. Did I remember, did we hear correctly that you got to experience this sort of sweetness and compassion in your colleagues, that maybe there hadn't been a reason to reveal that yet. And Benji's memory gave you a big reason or something like that. Was it, what, do I have it correct that your colleagues too were a big part of your healing, have been a big part of your healing?
Oh my God, it's hard to overstate how big that is and um, how obvious that should have been that, I was going to a community of palliative care clinicians who turns out are grief experts. Um, and I just, yeah, I couldn't imagine a softer landing spot. And actually, it relates to, kind of what we've been talking about. I had this experience when I was working on inpatient palliative care a couple weeks ago, where I was with our social worker and we were having a conversation on the phone with a daughter of a woman who was dying. And they had lost her sister a few years ago, so the patient's daughter. And she was sort of expressing in her sorrow, about her mom's experience. Um, and she sort of cried out on the phone, no parent should have to bury their child. Um, and I wasn't even really like thinking about myself, but at that moment, our social worker kind of reached out and like just put his hand on my arm. And we didn't say anything different to the patient, but it was just like this clear moment of him saying to me, I see you, I see how this might affect you, and I'm here for it. Even though it doesn't have anything to do explicitly with how we're going to proceed with patient care. Um,
Mm.
and it's things like that that have evolved too with my team, like where I feel like at the beginning it was big and explicit their support of me, and now it's gotten soft and subtle, but it's still so infused in how we practice and co-create space together. And I don't know, like I think something that has been really moving to me, both personally and professionally, has been realizing that losing Benji is not my loss alone. Like it's been felt by all those in our community, and somehow that does make it easier to bear. And I think given that I work on a palliative care team who are unafraid to share that they own it with me, that has been incredibly bolstering for me as a clinician, but really as a human. So I know not everyone has that luxury of like
Yeah.
built-in experts, but yeah, I sometimes now say, like, even though I like really struggle existentially with like what is the big picture, I think I answer the question of why did you go into palliative care differently now? And now it's really I went into palliative care because that was the only way I could have survived this.
Hmm.
So
Wow, that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, and shout out to your team.
yeah,
You know that, as you say, it's sort of like life when you're in this zone, the truth of life hanging by a thread just becomes very obvious, maybe, or more obvious. Um, and what feel like little things, like that, your social worker's hand on you. A gesture like that can effectively sort of change reality, can change the world. It's not, I don't, that's not a small thing. And while some of that may have flowed from his relative expertise in grief, it sounds like you also just have the good fortune working with kind people
true.
who open and can see beyond just the immediacy of their own needs, etc., or can include themselves in the world that they see, or something good, something basic. I guess I want to make the point here is, yeah, we're both lucky that we have these sort of technical experts around us all the time to hold all sorts of details. But what you're also pointing to is how frigging amazing human beings can be, period.
Mm.
Among other things, but humans can be outrageously marvelous, too. We can be that too. So anyway, okay, wow. Again, shout out to your team. So we've touched on this one way and another too, but is there more we want to say here? Um, yeah, anything left unsaid so far on this one, Bonnie?
Mm, even though I said like I've like become reboundaried, in some ways I think there was a lot of truth to that thing I started with when entering back into work, that like my charge being I want people to feel less alone, because I feel like that's the unique space we hold in a medical world that can feel very structured and therefore sometimes cold, that we're given the luxury of a little more time, a little more space, like not a lot on the agenda.
Mhm.
That yeah, I think it's worthwhile almost always in a healthcare system that I sometimes feel paralyzed to make change in, that it is not nothing when you have that 30 minutes or hour with another human being to, even with your like name badge on, to say like I see you, and I am here even as a representative of this place that can feel rigid and cold, to walk with you through what is so so hard. So yeah.
Well, I won't mess with that statement. Um, we reference, and I think this is our last slide, and then we can get to comments. Oh gosh. Um, Comments and questions, etc. So identity has been another thread throughout everything we've been talking about here. Um, my guess is your identity, your sense of self, your sense of identity. Well, let me not guess. What do you want to say about identity, Bonnie? I can jump in too, but
I think again, I'm still learning and evolving. I
mm,
do remember distinctly that the day Benji died, I feel like I lost myself in all my primary identities. Um, Mother, physician, a person of faith. I just felt like it all fell off of me. And that's why I was in survival mode, right? Because we're so like bolstered and conditioned by our identities to walk through the world. And if I didn't have any of those, I was just like, what do I do with a given day? Um,
mm,
and like we've talked about, work has been such a big part of reclaiming, obviously, my identity as physician, but in other ways too, right? Because in our work, it gives me opportunity to think about who I am in my personal life, who I am in my spiritual life. And I think one thing I think about is, obviously everyone who's been through grief really like doesn't like the idea of like, oh, when are you going to get over it or even get through it? And I think for me, better wording for it is how and who you are with your grief integrated. Because I think this is something I will wear for the rest of my life. Um, but it doesn't have to be the only thing. And it's sort of like I've built all those things back up and I'm still building and finding, and there may be new aspects of it, but now the grief is kind of like woven in too, right? Like Benji is part of me, loss is part of me, and it doesn't have to be foreign to my identity as mother or as doctor or as all the other hats I wear. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming either, right? Like it's not like I'm a grieving mother, I'm a grieving doctor, the way it was like for the first year and a half, like, that was the capital G. But it is very much a part of who I am in any of those spheres, and something that can be beautiful even as it was awful.
Mhm.
So yeah, I feel like I'm still reclaiming some of all of that and figuring out who I am, honestly. So you can ask me again in 5 years.
Right on. And I wish that for the world. I mean, I've grown really enamored with falling apart, I have to say.
Mhm.
It's a lot of what we do at Metal is just create a place where we can fall apart. You find that irreducible, like you said, like all that stuff that just fell off you. And yet there you are. You fall apart and you're still there. You disintegrate and you're still there. You find this irreducible nub of a Bonnie. And then on top of that, you get to put new clothes on her and different things, and then those will fall off. And no, I don't want to fetishize again any of this process that can be so hard, but there's something creative and beautiful and very real about identity, about falling apart and rebuilding. I think my guess is if we all got in the habit of doing that more often, it would be a better world or something like that, or we'd be more at peace in it or something. Um, but yeah, okay, Bonnie. Well, let's get to, I know that there are comments out there. Thank you, thank you, thank you for daring to be here with us and fall apart a little bit with us, and we can rebuild too. Okay, Sonia, what's going on out there?
Yeah, say ditto what BJ said. Bonnie, thank you so much for being here. We have a hand and a question. I'm gonna start with a question. Patty said, Bonnie, thank you for sharing with so much humanity. When my husband had declined significantly with brain cancer, we made an appointment with a palliative care doctor. He hated it. The doctor was so prescriptive in how she dealt with him. She started with wanting a full medical history, even though she had his chart. She wanted him to say what he saw as his prognosis, how much longer he expected to live. He felt completely alienated. Wondering if Bonnie or BJ, would you discuss how you treat each person gently and as an individual?
Oh,
Mm,
well, I'm so sorry Patty, for both, you know, your experience with your husband and also specifically his experience with that clinician. Um, and I certainly don't claim perfection. I'm sure there are patients who experienced, an appointment with me and it wasn't what they needed.
mm,
I I think hopefully one of the principles of palliative care is really to start with the patient and also a lot of permission asking. So I think part of how I'd answer your question is that we have a long first visit because we really do want to hear what the patient is experiencing. And not to say what you're saying of like, please repeat your chart, because we certainly read through the charts first, but almost more of like what can't be written in a chart, right? Like what has it been like to live with this illness? Like what are the things on your mind that are worrying you today? What like what fills you with hope or joy? And the questions aren't like very prescribed. It's sort of like in the flow of a conversation. Cause I feel like when I have a first visit with a patient, it's very much about like just kind of finding out where we're both at and where we're at in relationship to each other, and therefore how I can be helpful. Like for some people, it is like, I only want to talk about symptoms because I can't think about anything else until I feel physically better. So yeah, I think for me. I try to approach, especially a first encounter, really with a lot of open-handedness of like, hey, what are you bringing here today? I want to know how or if I should be part of that.
Mm. Yeah, right on. And yeah, as Bonnie's saying, Patty, it sounds like this palliative care doctor, who knows what was going on for him that day. As as you said, Bonnie, I shudder to think sometimes about all the what moments I showed up just perfectly wrong for somebody, and maybe he'd had no idea too. It's wild work. But it does sound like, Patty, that this man broke the sort of one of the cardinal rules of palliative care. Is what meet people where they are kind of statement. It sounds a little pat maybe or bumper stickery, but it really you know, beware of projections. And we humans do it a lot. And especially a busy doctor, you're going to do it a lot. You're just going to presume you know what this person needs, pattern recognition, um, and off you go. But so you just cannot hop over that moment of actually getting out of theory, getting out of the chart and going to the person in real time and figuring out who they are and where they are and go from there. Sounds like this person hopped right over that. And again, I'm sure I have too. This is one of those reasons why I've met a lot of palliative care docs or colleagues of ours, Bonnie, who will say things like, who are really good technicians, but will say things, oh, I'm terrible at existential stuff. That stuff freaks me out. And it seems like such a big flag to me because under the banner of existential meaning making identity stuff is where so much of this much more exquisite thing is happening, how we make meaning, what we do with meaninglessness, how we misplace meaning, how we thought it was one thing, it turns out it was another. uh that's where so much this action is, I think. And sort of also a note here, just a pet hope for our field, that the existential piece, to put a name to it, really gets upticked as one of the most important things that we do. Anyway, but back to your question, Patty, that is not the way palliative care training works now for the most part. So the field is evolving.
And do you both have a couple seconds to go over for this last question here? Is that okay? Okay, perfect. All right, Andrew, you may have to unmute yourself on your end.
Let's see. Am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Let's see. Oh, great. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi,
This is
Andy.
Andy Gaines. I was one of those clients of Bonnie's, who was working with my wife and was just so, precious, and it was so valuable even before you had your Benji experience. But, I and BJ, what an honor it is to be on this call with you. I've followed you over the years, and you're both doing amazing work. And I just wanted to say that going through this loss, this journey with my wife, and the loss and the grief and the kind of seeing the world, um, in a different way, with more kind of the fire of the moment, the mystery, the unknown, all of that, was so deeply meaningful to me that as I'm stepping back into my work life, I have been moving in the direction of studying death doula work, and I'm wanting to work with families to, assist and support them in this transition, which is so hard, and it also is is what it is. And I'm just grateful to be in the in the current with your wisdoms coming out and speaking of just the humanity of it all. And I just grateful to be here with you. So
Mm. Nice to meet
Well,
you.
oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, that's it.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Andy. I'm really glad you're here. And that was so beautiful to hear, Bonnie. Sorry.
Oh, I feel like, Andy, it's so nice to hear your voice. Like all of this brings me back to reciprocity, because I met Lita, as Andy said, before Benji died, and we knew each other over the course of a couple of years. And I've shared with Andy since, but I thought often of Lita after Benji died because she actually taught me so much about being a mother. As that was one of her primary griefs, as she approached her own end. And I think knowing she had gone before me as someone where that parent-child loss had also happened, although she was the one who died, kind of fortified me in early days and months. And that wasn't something I was able to share with Andy till much later, but yeah, there is something so magical about reciprocity. And it's not always in the moment, right? Like this is a prime example of like, God, like how much I was held by that relationship much later and in very different ways than I would have ever expected. So grateful to you and your family, Andy.
Isn't that wild? You just described a kind of immortality that Lita
Mm.
had and Benji has.
Yeah.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
Mm.
mhm.
Well, folks. Sonia, other comments or questions out there? And Andy, by the way, I'm glad to hear you were thinking about the doula work. Jump on in. This is a big river. The water's freezing and hot. Come on, come on in. Um, so what else is going on?
I think those are the questions. I'm assuming everyone is feeling like me and just kind of just sitting with everything you've shared, Bonnie. It was really beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, no other questions or comments. Thank you. Thank you again for being here and sharing yourself with us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, everybody. Bonnie, thank you for daring to need something. Thank you for daring to be affected and to show us how therapeutic that is for everybody involved. And thank you, Benji, for affecting us. Beautiful.
Glad to be walking with all of you, really. Yeah.
Bonnie, before I end this here, I just want to read this comment from Shelley. She said, a huge thank you to Bonnie for this incredible offering. I am an oncology NP and a mother and have had a year of losses. I am inspired and touched. Thank you, Benji.
All right, you guys. Well, have a weekend out there.
That feels like the right ending. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.